Okay, let's start it off again. Hi, I'm Pat Herndon. Welcome back from lunch. We're going to hear today from Marty Goddard from the San Francisco Public Library. Marty was a teacher at the New Mexico School for the Deaf before curiosity took her to library school at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. With her MLS in hand, she worked as a reference librarian at Pikes Peak Library District in Colorado before returning to NMSD, is that New Mexico School for the Deaf, as a school librarian. In 1989, Marty became the Deaf Services Program Manager at the San Francisco Public Library. Since 1998, she's been San Francisco Public Library's Access Services Manager and ADA Coordinator for Public Programs and Services. Access Services staff at San Francisco Public Library provide direct services for patrons with disability through a Deaf Services Center and a talking book and braille library. They also advise and work with IT staff to provide computers with assistive technology throughout the San Francisco Public Library system, with collections and technical services and web services staff to ensure that online resources are accessible, and with community programs and partnership staff to help ensure that public programs are accessible for patrons who need accommodations. So Marty, take it off and let us hear what you've got to say.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the San Francisco Public Library. It's a real honor to be with all of you today. I wish we could be together in a room so I could answer questions through our time together, but please do make note of your questions and either send them in or save them for the Q&A at the end. The image at the bottom of this slide shows you how to sign library. This sign is made with the American Annual Alphabet, L, and you have your palm facing toward the person you're speaking to and rotate your hand clockwise as you look at the back of your hand. So try that yourselves and you have a sign if you didn't have one before. Deafness is a small incidence disability and often an invisible one. As you can see, while the percentage of people who experience deafness or serious difficulty hearing is slightly larger in Georgia than in the US as a whole, only 6.4% of Georgia's residents have hearing disabilities. People who are deaf or hard of hearing experience many different kinds and degrees of hearing levels that affect communication. And communicating effectively with these patrons is not only essential in a practical way, it's a requirement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Along with these 6.4% of residents who are deaf or seriously hard of hearing, I believe our library should provide materials and information for their family members, friends and neighbors, and deaf community service providers like interpreters and teachers. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking about communicating effectively, technology, collections, outreach, programs and exhibits, space, and staff. Though I said that deafness or hearing loss is often invisible, there are some clues. For example, you may see people signing. The two young women in this slide, the one on the left is saying, "How are you?" And the other is responding, "Fine." You may notice that a person is cupping an ear or tilting their head toward you as you're talking and intently watching your face. Sometimes they may speak very loudly or maybe may seem to be having a hard time understanding you. And of course, you also may notice that people are wearing hearing aids. To communicate effectively, the most important thing for you to do is follow the patron's lead. Face them and look at them directly as you're talking. Don't turn to pull a book off the shelf or look down at the desk when you're talking, but make sure they can see your face. Find a place where light is on your face and try to avoid standing where you have backlighting, like a window with bright sunshine streaming through. If you think of taking a photograph where you really can't see somebody's face because the sun was behind them, that's what happens when you're talking. Try to find a quieter place to talk if other people are talking or there's noisy activity nearby. And use natural speech and facial expressions. Don't shout, don't talk slowly, and don't exaggerate, because all of those things make it harder to understand what you're saying. Try to use short sentences and keep an eye on whether the patron is understanding what you're talking about. Repeat what you're saying, or write back and forth, or type back and forth on a computer if needed. And if a patron comes into your library with an interpreter, look at the patron and talk to them directly. Do not talk to the interpreter, and don't say things like ask her or tell him. Just have a conversation. These tips and more are on a handout that you received called Communicating in the Library with People Who Are Deaf or Hard of Hearing. This was created by librarians at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. As you may know, Gallaudet is a small liberal arts school whose goal is to ensure the intellectual and professional advancement of deaf and hard of hearing people bilingually. Everyone uses both American Sign Language and English. Sometimes communication will involve technology, so I'm going to show you some examples. Video phones. Video phones are what are most commonly used now by people who are deaf and who sign to communicate through the phone. And people who use ASL can directly call another deaf person and sign with them to have their conversation, but they also can call hearing people. So there is one gentleman who often uses our Deaf Services Center video phone to call his deaf mother, or to call his hearing mother, and he dials her number, and when she answers, an interpreter appears on the screen and signs for him what his mom is saying and speaks back to her what he is saying. You're probably aware, it's really important for you to know, the two that you see here are from Sorensen Video Relay Service and Purple Video Relay Service. Those are two companies, and these are available for libraries at no charge. You just have to have the telecommunication line available. And we actually have dedicated DSL lines, even though that's old technology. But the dedicated lines ensure that the signing doesn't look shaky like this, or because of slow upload and download time. So if you want a video phone for public use, you should be able to get one at no charge for your library. The ADA still says that we have to have TTYs. And I'm just showing you, we have an old teletype machine in our room that was used when I was a teacher of deaf kids. Some of my deaf colleagues still had these in their phones. So this is called the Green Monster, and they were repurposed teletype machines after World War II. And you can see there's a roll for paper in it. The floor would shake as the conversation was typed out on this thing. On the left, the smaller white one is a modern TTY, and you type back and forth to make calls with people. We only have one person really who still calls us frequently on a TTY, and I actually called the Department of Justice for someone else. They said that because that when you have a video phone available, or when your staff are capable of communicating effectively, meaning they are comfortable taking and making calls through a video relay service, you actually do not legally have to have a TTY anymore. That's just because they are not so commonly used. Assistive listening is something you probably are aware of, and you can see now a couple of kinds of assistive listening devices. The top one on the table is for a small group of people. There's a conference microphone, and the rectangular gray device you see there is the transmitter. And then we have receivers that we give to people to use with one of these two headphones. Or on the right, you see something that just looks like a gray kind of loop of wire. That's called a neck loop, and it goes over someone's neck and transmits directly to their hearing aids. So that's comfortable and more effective than using a headphone. At the bottom right, you see a small sort of silvery device. This is called a pocket talker, and it's a one-to-one communication device. At SFPL, we have these in all of our branch libraries and all of the major reference desks in the main library. And we ask staff to offer them to people. If you have those folks who are coming in looking like they're having a hard time understanding or are talking very loudly, you can offer a pocket talker, and people again would use a neck loop or a headphone to have a conversation with you in a more normal tone of voice. Something really fancy is the Ubi Duo, which is on the bottom left. This is a device with two separate keyboards and screens, and you can sit down and communicate back and forth with the patron through typing. You see a blue and a yellow boxes on the screen, and those are the two sides of the conversation appearing. This microphone may be a little surprising, but when you are in a meeting and a microphone is available, use it. Please don't be one of those speakers who says, "Oh, I have a loud voice. You're going to be able to hear me at the back of the room." Please don't do that. Stay in one place, face the audience, speak normally, and use the microphone. Lots of people in the audience will appreciate being able to hear you more easily and more clearly, even if they don't have a hearing disability. Computers also are key to communication for patrons. As I said, you actually can use one on your desk and type back and forth to talk with someone, but people come in to use public computers. And I wanted you to see one of the two that are in the Deaf Services Center, because this one includes ZoomText software. You probably already have heard about ZoomText during this conference, but with this software, individual users can change print size, color, contrast, choose a cursor or print pointer style that's easier for them to see, and can use a variety of magnifiers on the screen. Why do we have this in the Deaf Services Center? Because we have people who are deaf and blind or have low vision who come in to use our services, and they need ZoomText. So we have both a conventional computer and this computer with ZoomText in our room. Remember, I suggested typing back and forth on a desk computer if needed. Sometimes the simplest tool is the most effective. Just be ready to write if people need to write to communicate. Finally, if you have viewing stations for DVDs or even old VHS materials, it's really important for all of your staff to know how to help patrons who need them launch closed captions. So I just wanted you to see, we have these video viewing stations to use the materials in our collection. The machines handle both DVDs and VHS. Why still VHS? Because some of our old materials have never been made available on DVDs. So on to collections. All of us are thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how to make collections in our libraries relevant for the people in our communities. We want patrons to see themselves and their experiences through the characters and experiences in books and films they can borrow from our libraries. And this is true for people who are deaf or hard of hearing as well. When I visit other libraries, I usually make a beeline for the 360s and the 419 area just to see what I find. And very often I find just one shelf with a couple of general titles about deaf history or deaf culture or hearing loss, and books for learning American Sign Language. SFPL's Deaf Services Center has lots of shelves filled with materials for this community. And again, not only for people who are themselves deaf or hard of hearing, but for family members, friends and neighbors, sign language interpreters, teachers, and others who provide services in the community. So our nonfiction and fiction has books and DVDs about ASL and other sign languages. We actually have a lot of visitors in San Francisco from other countries, and we have books with sign languages from Asian countries and European countries. So people like seeing their own languages in the center as well. We have books about deafness and coping with hearing loss. And this coping with hearing loss thing, I think, is really important because not only do we have people who are losing their hearing, who are experiencing hearing losses, but adults whose parents are needing to learn a new way of communicating and coping with the hearing loss. So those are good for them. We have books about law. What are the rights of people who are deaf or hard of hearing? And we have books with deaf characters. You see a little d and a big D in the word deaf, and that is commonly used to show the little d is happen not to be able to hear well. And the big D expresses the community of people who are deaf culturally. ASL may be their first language, and they are deeply embedded in a community of other ASL users. They may be people whose parents are deaf and ASL was their first language. So the big D stands for people who are culturally deaf. So we have books with deaf characters, and we have books by deaf authors. So we really do go looking for those things. Sometimes the books by deaf authors say very little about their own hearing level, but it respects the fact that they are creators. We also have materials about the same topics. You can see on this slide, we have DVDs about deaf culture or history. We have ASL poetry and fables and fairy tales in American Sign Language. We have the very useful Alcoholics Anonymous 12 Steps book in ASL. We have a number of DVDs for learning American Sign Language, and these are very popular with our users. Deaf Mosaic is a series that was produced at Gallaudet University over a very long time, and it has a lot of sort of 60 minutes-ish, newsy old stories about what was going on in the deaf community. And we have movies with deaf characters. For example, The River Wild has a father and his adult daughter. The father is deaf and his adult daughter signs with him. And the fact that they can communicate is a really key plot point in this movie. So it's a fun one. On the right, you'll see a series of DVDs. In 1984, with funding from the National Endowment for Humanities and an organization called Deaf Media, SFPL Media production staff created this series called American Culture, The Deaf Perspective. They're about deaf heritage, deaf folklore, deaf literature, and deaf minorities. And even though these videos were made decades ago, they're still relevant enough that they are used in deaf culture and American Sign Language classes all over the US. And you can see these videos on the SFPL YouTube channel. Our books, our materials are for people of all ages, both nonfiction. In this slide, you can see an autobiography by a deaf author named Henry Kaiser. It's called Flight of the Gin Fizz, and it's about Mr. Kaiser's experiences as a pilot. And you can see the hearing loss source book, which is again for those people who are experiencing hearing loss and need to find resources for coping with their hearing loss. And When Your Child is Deaf, obviously, is a book for parents. And then we have fiction. Again, books by deaf authors and books with deaf characters. El Defo is both. C.C. Bell is the author of this award-winning graphic novel that's for tweens, but really people of all ages can enjoy it. Talking about her superhero persona as a deaf person. Book in Bed is a baby board book that is a really popular one. This one really moves. So it has signs and written English. And in the middle of this picture, you see a title called Dead Man's Hand. And there's a whole series of mysteries with a deaf PI by an author named Penny Warner. And we have all of those books in our collection. Because this is a special collection, the Deaf Services Center has a number of historic titles, and on the left you see a newspaper called Silent News and The Silent Worker and The Deaf American. So these were published for decades, and we had people hurrying in every month to read the newest issue. On the right, you see more current titles, and these are, I would actually recommend that you look for things like most of these. Top left is the American Annals of the Deaf. This is a professional journal, and it's for educators. And this has been published since the middle 1800s. And it's my understanding it's the longest duration published professional journal in the United States. We have it on microfilm, we have it in print, it's useful. You see Gallaudet Today, which is obviously from Gallaudet University, and then California News, which is the newsletter from our School for the Deaf in the state of in the northern part of California. I would think some people would be interested in the newsletter from the Georgia School for the Deaf. On the right, you see Hearing Loss Magazine, which is a general publication for people who are experiencing hearing loss as adults. We also have the Hearing Loss Californian. So this has local activities and information of interest. And Deaf Life is just a really fun general interest magazine that a lot of people, not only people who are deaf, might enjoy reading because you can learn about this whole new community. If you have a local history center or archives, you really should consider collecting materials of interest to your local deaf community. And I won't go into this a lot, but on the left, there's a picture of things from a file we have in the Deaf Services Center about deaf peddlers. It has a cartoon, it has a number of articles, and it has ABC cards or manual alphabet cards that our staff have purchased at airports and on buses and on BART, which is our train that we ride to work. Often they have a little sign, like one of them, somebody was peddling at Christmas time, so it has a Santa on it. And there's also a Canadian flag on a key ring here. One of our staff members went to Toronto and was approached in the airport by somebody. So we collect that just because it's interesting. But then we have things that are really local history. And the Deaf Aid Center in San Francisco was very important to our community for a very long time. And now our Deaf Aid Center has closed because thankfully so many more people are healthy, and all the materials from that are in our San Francisco History Center. So Many librarians say they don't have people asking for the materials I've been talking about. And I would say this is likely because members of their local community don't know that their public libraries have anything of interest to them or anticipate that they might find barriers. So I think it's really important that you find people in your community. And of course, you start by Googling Deaf Georgia. And I found a number of organizations by doing that. The Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Georgia Commission for the Deaf or Hard of Hearing, State of Georgia ADA Coordinator's Office has a lot of good resources. And the Georgia School for the Deaf and your local schools are natural places to find people who live in your community. So I really suggest connecting with these service providers and your local schools and invite people in. Once you create some programs that are of interest, I think you can advertise them through the EPG News Facebook page. So you can see what other organizations are doing and think about posting your own programs there. So after you get ready, I'll talk to you about some public programs that we have done at our public library. Obviously, we have ASL Baby Story Time, and you can see some beautiful little kids and families and caregivers around a librarian who's blowing bubbles in a story time there during one of our bi-weekly ASL Baby Story Times. We have author talks. Michael Kouros wrote this book called How Rebuilt, How Becoming Part Computer Made Me More Human. He himself is deaf, but his experience with the cochlear and his experience with having a cochlear implant was really interesting for a lot of people in our community. And then we have community gatherings here. I have old stuff on this slide, I guess, but again, we had a celebration of the Deaf AIDS Center, and just 2 years ago, we celebrated World AIDS Day with our deaf community in the Deaf Services Center. We had a wonderful exhibition of artwork and photographs of people and snacks, and it was just really fun to bring people together. More practical, or you can do film screenings. And when you do your film screenings, please turn on your closed captions. We turn on closed captions for all of our public programs, and we find that I do not believe I have ever had a hearing person gripe about the closed captions or the captions being distracting. And people who have hearing losses have said they appreciate having them. So use those closed captions and think about things that are specifically for your deaf community and provided in ASL and with captioning. So here are some examples of programs we've had. We've had a Write Your Own Will workshop by a lawyer, and financial planning and domestic violence in the deaf community, where to find resources, and deafness and addiction and emergency preparedness. So fun things and serious learning things. You may not have all those things going on. So I was trying to think of what you might do. Better Hearing and Speech Month is every May, and we always have an audiologist come in and talk about hearing aids and testing and helping people learn about resources during the month of May. There is an International Week of the Deaf every year in September, and you can see that it commemorates the time when the first World Congress of the World Federation of the Deaf was held. So the WFD is an international organization. And for the past few years, they've had an International Day of Sign Languages during that week. In 2021, there's a different focus for each day of the week, with an overall theme of We Sign for Human Rights. And your library can become a member of the Described and Captioned Media Project and borrow and bring captioned films and audio described films to your library free of charge if you have people who are deaf and people who are blind, and or people who are blind in your audience. You also are responsible for making sure all your public programs are accessible. For example, with interpreter services, and maybe not just with the straight ASL, we sometimes have deaf people who request also a certified deaf interpreter. So we bring in a team of just a standard ASL interpreter, a hearing person who's interpreting, with the certified deaf interpreter who's adjusting the language for the deaf audience. We have real-time captioning. And here you can see the program when Michael Korist was here talking about his book. You can see the real-time captions, the live captions on the screen, and those were for people in the audience, but Mr. Korist actually used those during the question and answer period after his talk. And in front of the podium, you see a woman with a steno machine. So she's who is creating the captions that are appearing on that screen. I'm not going to say more about assistive listening. There are a number of different kinds of assistive listening systems. A loop system where a loop is embedded in the floor. Infrared systems where there's a transmitter that people cue into from all over the room. And usually those are in fixed seat auditoriums, and FM systems. What you see here is an FM system, which is like a little radio station broadcasting directly to people in the room. And you really must caption videos created by your library and posted on your website. This wonderful gentleman is Ron Hirano, talking about a woman who founded schools for deaf kids in the Philippines. Her name was Delight Rice. In the Deaf Services Center, we have exhibitions of artwork by local deaf artists and sometimes sort of nationally known deaf artists. If you have exhibits or displays in your library, please consider inviting deaf artists to come in. Sometimes you'll just find a really fine photographer like Claire Cassidy, who sees things through her deaf eyes. Sometimes, if you notice on the bottom, Devia, The Art of Ellen Mansfield, both Ellen Mansfield and David Call produce deaf view image art. So things that reflect their culture and their experience. So you may want to have some really specific deafness related things and some more things that are just having you highlight the creativity and talent of deaf people in your community. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about space. So our Deaf Services Center is a place that was planned for and built between 1990 and 96 when the current main library opened, and we worked really closely with members of our deaf community to design it. May look old-fashioned, but people wanted a bulletin board. They wanted a place to post and find activities and classes going on in the neighborhood, or in the community. We bought a rug for our ASL Baby Storytime that has multi-ethnic kids around it signing, cute little faces of kids signing different words. So that's central in a way to keep kids in one place when we're having our ASL Baby Storytime. People asked for a comfy place to sit and talk. And I want you to look at not only the two chairs that are clustered here, because those are comfy sitting and talking chairs, but note that all of the shelves within the Deaf Services Center are low. And they are low so that our deaf staff can see people all over the room, and so that we can communicate easily in the room. It's also an enclosed space, and it's really quiet with no reverberation. So it's easy as possible for people to hear in this room, but we didn't want people to be completely segregated. So while we do not have any windows to the outside that would give us that bright backlighting and make it hard to see, we do have windows into the greater library. And you can see out there, the stacks are higher. Oops. And sorry, awkward again. All of the tables in the Deaf Services Center are round for a reason. It's really easier for people to see one another and communicate around a round table than to sit next to each other at a rectangular one. So you can see everybody's face around a round table. And I believe, well, so I'm going to just say on opening day, I had one person come in and burst into tears and say, this is it. This is what we were asking for. And we have this very deliberate space, which I believe now could be called Deaf Space, though it predates a movement that was born at Gallaudet University in 2005. Based upon what I've learned about Deaf Space from Gallaudet, I would have requested automatic sliding doors into the center so people don't have to interrupt their conversation, push open a door, let it close behind them, and then continue talking. So I wish we had automatic doors. And we're working right now on the idea of painting the walls a soft blue or gray or green so that it's easier on deaf eyes. And while you will not be designing, likely will not be designing a whole room that's made for deaf people, you can make your space more friendly by having at least round tables and, you know, figuring out ways people can sit together and talk. So that's space. Finally, staff who are comfortable meeting and working with people who are deaf or hard of hearing are absolutely key to your success. And when you do staff training, I hope you will do what I say and not what I'm doing today. I hope you will have people who are deaf or hard of hearing doing the training for your staff. We have found a lot of really good teachers in our community, but these folks are the current Deaf Services Center staff members, 3 of whom are deaf. All of us are bilingual. One person has a cochlear implant. Another person speaks Arabic as well as English and ASL. So, you know, we don't have a lot of ethnic diversity here, but we at least do have people who can talk to our patrons when they come in. So that's our take on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Deaf Services Center. So that's it, except for questions. And I hope I didn't talk too long here.
Well, Marty, I'm going to assist you with your questions. I'm Gina Martin.
Thank you, Gina.
And the first question that we're showing is just clarification on your video phone devices. You mentioned Soroson, and they just want clarification. Was it Purple, P-U-R-P-L-E?
That's correct.
Okay.
But you may find more. Look for who are the video relay service providers in your area and talk to them about the idea of having a public video phone in your space.
Okay, great. All right, let's see. The next question is, do we have to have an analog phone line for TTYS?
I believe so. I mean, I don't know of TTYs that, I believe so. I mean, I think there needs to be a direct connect to your phone.
Okay.
I hope
Most
that
likely,
answers the question.
and they can check with their IT department, I'm sure, for assistance
Yeah.
with that. Okay, all right. Are there devices similar to TTY that connect through data drops rather than regular analog phone lines?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
It's an old-fashioned technology. And you know, as I said, I think so few people are using them now. Maybe they're no longer being developed. You know, they're not keeping up with the times because people aren't using them.
Right. Okay, next question. How are some effective ways to communicate while wearing a face mask? That's a good question.
It's an excellent question. And of course, we've had to deal with that as you are. We have really specific guidelines for people who are at our grab and go space. They have sneeze guards,
Mhm.
and we tell people they must stay separated by those 6 feet. They cannot just use a face shield. They must use masks as well. So one of the things we did was buy some masks with clear,
Mhm.
so you can see the mouth. So we have some of those, but they're expensive and they can not be cleaned and used very many times. So that's kind of too bad. One thing that we have talked about, and it's been problematic, is having 2 cups with writing tools, you know, used ones and sanitized ones, and having people just write on a piece of paper and take it away. Or we have in some places had golf pencils and we say, keep the pencil. So write, take away your paper, take away the pencil. That's not the best communication, but you really do have to protect yourself and the folks who are coming.
Right. Everyone has to be flexible. So the next question is, what kind of gatherings do you have now with pandemic shutdowns?
In the Deaf Services Center, the only thing that we have kept running specifically for our deaf community is a book club. A monthly sit down and talk about books. And the person who runs our book club works hard to find things that are available both as ebooks and, you know, that there are a number of print copies so people can pick them up at our SFPL to go locations. But the book group is the only thing we have done during this time. I hate to say that. Our blind service, our Talking Books and Braille Center is doing all kinds of stuff. Our Deaf Services Center is not.
Okay. And I believe Pat answered this question, but I'll let you take a stab at it as well. Hearing aids are very expensive and not covered by a lot of insurances. Do you have suggestions for people on help getting the hearing aids? And Pat recommended a Georgia Tech website that provides funding sources for all types of assistive technology, but you may have some other suggestions.
I think that's one of the most difficult things we find for people. And in San Francisco, we have the Hearing and Speech Center of Northern California. And I think there, folks try to work with people to get things that reduce costs, but it's just plain expensive. I have no fix for that problem.
I understand. All right. Could you recommend something to use for captioning?
A human being. I mean, seriously, I think that it's expensive to hire people, but we actually use a company called TCG Incorporated, the captioning group, which is, believe it or not, located in Canada. But they offer absolutely fabulous services for us. And so they caption live during programs, and then we have that transcript. So what we mostly do at this point are live online programs, and we get the transcript from them, and then one of our humans goes in and corrects anything that needs to be corrected. I'm really happy to say that Zoom is getting better and better at automatic captioning. So I think a lot of people are using Zoom and they're working hard to make sure that it's accurate. Teams is great. And you know, it's been interesting to me that I think I went off the topic. So I think you do need to hire somebody to do captioning. It is so labor intensive for your staff to try to go back and caption on something fully. If you can use automatic captioning in YouTube or Google Docs or something and get a transcript, you can go back and correct captioning as you need to for your website. I hope that answered, or you can hire somebody to do the job for you.
I think that's a good answer. And then Pat also typed in the chat response that Georgia uses Sorensen. So
That's really interesting. Good.
What I was also answering to for captioning is our folks over at Georgia Tech Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation offer a captioning service as well. And I learned recently when I was shopping for ASL that there is a state contract for interpretation services, that it's a state contract, and it's good for any government agency in Georgia to access this contract rate. And they do offer ASL services. ASL is quite expensive, but the captioning, of course, is a different topic. But I know the folks at Georgia Tech do that, and apparently there's a lot of commercial services that do that as well.
You know, something that has really interested me during this closed time is that we have several deaf staff members, and I should have said more about that. I hope you will hire some people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We have somebody in tech services, we have a custodian, we have people in deaf services, we have a lot of people who are hard of hearing or deaf on our staff. And I have been fascinated that when we have all staff meetings, I have offered to arrange for ASL interpreters as well as captioning, and our staff have said they don't need it. So that totally surprised me. We very regularly have ASL interpreters for our staff meetings and public programs, but our staff are happy with the captions, and actually they use their phone. A couple of people use their phones with their preferred interpreter services, and they just call and have the interpreter and use the captions. So it's a different world.
I'd like to jump in here too, regarding the video translation telephone system such as Sorensen. We had a representative from Sorensen speak at our last accessibility conference. And there are programs where Sorensen will provide devices for eligible persons who are hearing impaired, but Sorensen does not provide phones for public agencies. So that's just something to consider.
Well, I'm gonna say that we have a Sorensen public booth, because they knew we have deaf patrons. So if you can make a case that you have people who are deaf using the library. Of course, for our deaf staff members, they have provided them too, but Sorensen typically will provide a video phone only for use by people who are deaf. But this is the first time I've ever heard anybody say Sorensen won't do it. And they do provide the devices free for people in their homes too, if they have high-speed cable or good internet. So I would check in maybe with a different rep and just talk to them about your community.
Yeah, we can do that, and anybody can. I'll have a contact, at least the last time I put on a conference, we got a rep. And in Georgia, I want everybody to know we also have the relay service, the TTY style relay service, and in Georgia we use Hamilton Relay. And they too have presented at our conference in the past.
Yeah, and people do still sometimes use TTYs, and of course use TTY relay services, but hardly. I literally think it has been years since anybody has called us through a TTY relay service.
And the one thing I would say too is post our conference, one of the librarians told us that she brought in someone from Hamilton to do a staff training, not on how to use a TTY phone, but how to respond to someone who has contacted the library using TTY relay, just so that a staff member will understand what the process is and how come they're talking to a middleman, so to speak, to accomplish the communication with their actual patron?
Would you like me to say a little bit about that?
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so when you get a call either through a TTY relay service or a video relay service, you will have an interpreter or a communication assistant in between you and the caller. So they will call and say, hello, you have a call from a deaf person and I'm a relay operator. Usually they'll say, I'm relay operator number blah, 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 so that you can keep track of who they are. But you, when you're talking to somebody using a TTY, you absolutely have to take turns. You have to wait until the person who is calling you is finished with what they have typed and say GA or go ahead. And then you say your part, and when you're done with your answer, you say go ahead, and you actually really take turns. Go ahead through your conversation, because somebody is literally typing in between. And at the end, you say go ahead to signing off. You'll see GA, go ahead, to SK, stop keying, is what the relay operator would say. But you can then say, oh, hold on a minute. I just thought of one more source that may be helpful, and you can continue. But with the TTY, you really have to take turns. With the video relay service, I have found that the conversation is very natural. You don't have to wait for that go ahead kind of cue, but you wait for natural pauses in conversation as you do in other telephone calls, and it's just very smooth and comfortable.
Okay, you ready for more questions?
Yes.
Okay. All right, do you have ideas or references for programming for deaf youth other than ASL story times?
Oh, kids are kids. I mean, seriously, crafts programs, if you offer crafts programs for other kids in your library, do that. Just make sure that you know how to communicate, and try to think of some things that may be sort of deaf culture or deaf sensitive, like if you're making bookmarks, have some cutouts of hands that they can glue into the I love you sign to put on their bookmark, or, include some things for them. But really, any program you offer for any kid should be fun for any other child.
That's true. And I know we talked a lot about closed captioning options. We have a question about software recommendations for closed captioning for maybe a library who is a little bit watching their funds a little bit more.
I have no idea. I haven't kept up. I'm very sorry to say I haven't kept up for a long time, and I don't know what's out there in the world now, but I think that having automatic captions, as does YouTube, and as I said, Google Docs, we've had people experimenting with having a live Google Doc that's streaming as the program goes on. So those things are free, or included in what you have. And then you may need to go back and make corrections if you're putting something on your library's channel.
Right. And we just have a recommendation. We've talked about ways to find funding to assist our patrons in getting devices. And so someone recommended the Lion Lighthouse Foundations with hearing aids for fixed income people. So I just want to share that with our audience.
That's great. I forgot. I have not used that service, but yeah, what is it called? It's, there is a deaf component to Lions International. So yeah, so that is a great suggestion.
Okay.
If I could Google, I would do it.
All right. Do we have any more questions? We've got a few more minutes with Marty.
Okay, then hang on, I'm using my phone.
Okay.
It may be something like Ear of the Lion or something like that.
Well, this patron, this librarian group recommended Lion Lighthouse
That may
Foundation.
be a more local
Okay.
thing. Because I'm seeing for Ear of the Lion Foundation.
Okay.
So I would look for that. If you look at Ear of the Lion Foundation, you can possibly find a local group nearer your community.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for helping with that. That was great.
Oh, no problem. And we're getting a lot of great comments, a lot of praise for you. And let's see. Someone just wanted to share their learning sign language through lifeprint.com YouTube classes. And we're getting lots of thank yous
Ah,
for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Happy to
It
have
really
you.
has been a pleasure, and I feel like I've just unloaded a lot of stuff, but on the first slide, I put my email address. I'm marty@sfpl.org. I will welcome questions through email, and I'll do my best to answer them.
And all of our speakers and presentations are located, speaker information and presentation are located on the CVent registration page sent out to all of our registered participants today. Any other additional handouts that were offered. Well, we don't have any more questions. Pat, would you like to give us new instructions for our next session?
I would. First, I really want to thank you, Marty. This has been a wonderful presentation, and you gave us so many ideas to think about. I want to let everybody know that our next presentation starts at 2:30, and it will be a much more local look at hearing impairment and ways in Georgia that we can help our Department of Education. So we're going to be hearing from Stormy Cone, and she's going to talk about hearing impairment, literacy, and Georgia's mobile audiology lab. So I think it's something you will find interesting, and it is a partnership that we've developed for Georgia Public Libraries. So thanks. See you at 2:30.